Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's great to be in this virtual space with you all for this workshop, which is supporting language learners in the art making space with the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. My name is Kinsey Keck. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with brown hair. I have long bangs. The rest of my hair is pulled back in a clip. And I am wearing a fun V-neck t-shirt that is like hunter green and cream colored horizontal stripes. I'm sitting in my kitchen. So behind me, you can see a white wall with a few framed photos, a Texas shaped decorative item over my shoulder. And I'm also the programming and membership manager for the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable. As many of you may know, the Roundtable is a grassroots service organization that works to improve and advance the state of arts education in New York City and New York State with professional development workshops, advocacy, online resources, and other platforms to connect you all, our arts and education community. Although we are meeting currently on Zoom, the Roundtable would like to acknowledge that we do work and live on unceded lands. Mannahatta, or the place that is also widely known as New York City, exists on the contemporary and ancestral homelands of the Canarsie, Munsee Lenape, and Wappinger people. These sovereign nations and communities are still thriving here, and we continue to occupy their lands. So we would like to give a moment of respect to them, as well as to the Black and immigrant communities, which have helped build the city that we know today. As we recognize that all of our past, presents, and futures are intertwined, we would like to uplift just a handful of contemporary Indigenous arts organizations that we can all support and learn from. I'm just going to paste those in the chat. Please save those links. Take a look at these organizations, learn about them, learn about other organizations in your area, support them with donations, most importantly, if you can. I also invite you to share any organizations that you would like to highlight or other resources in the chat with those of us on the call today. Thank you. Just a couple reminders before we get going. If you're having any trouble with Zoom at all, you can just message me, Kinsey. Just send me a private message. I'm here to help. Please do make sure that while we're in this meeting that you keep your mic setting on mute unless you're the one speaking, so that we can all hear each other and communicate clearly. I imagine many of you will have questions throughout our workshop today. Please do use the chat to put your questions in. We'll take a few breaks throughout this session for questions. I'll keep monitoring on those, and Jen will keep an eye on them as well. So do use the chat to put your questions in, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time to answer all of them throughout the session. We do have closed captioning available on this call. To access that, you'll just click on your toolbar. You should see something that either says captions or live transcript. That may be in the More button on your toolbar with the 3 dots. Then from there, you just click show subtitle and you should have access to captions. Lastly, this session is being recorded and it will be made available to you all. I will send a follow-up email probably in about a week with the link to that edited recording, and you can feel free to share that with folks in your network as well as any additional resources that we have on the call. Whew. I think that's it for me. Thank you all for listening. Now it's my very sincere pleasure to turn it over to our facilitator today. Welcome everyone, Jen Mohr, who is a language and literacy specialist. Welcome, Jen. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Kinsey. It's a pleasure to be here. And I've been tasked with a very difficult assignment today to combine 25 years of teaching experience for multilingual learners into under a 2-hour workshop. I have so many things I want to share with you, and I do want to be mindful of everyone's time and also be able to connect with you all individually. We have a very large group of participants this evening, so that makes it even more challenging on my side to really connect with each one of you, but I do want to hear the things that you have to say in relation to our conversation tonight, and also address the questions that might come to mind. So we are going to have moments spread out throughout the session where I will ask for comments, questions, and connections so that we could move through segments of material and then have a break to be able to hear what all of you are thinking. So as Kinsey said, if you have a question or a comment, in the meantime, put it in the chat and we will definitely address that in one of those segments. The presentation will be made available to you so that you can also refer back to it. It's very dense. It has a lot of information in it that we will talk through, but you know, maybe one or two things will actually go with you when the session closes this evening, and you'll always want to have that material to look back to. So we will get started, and once again, thank you for welcoming me here tonight to talk about this topic. So we will have three main sections of information, and as I said, I will talk for about 20 minutes on the material, and then we will have a 10-minute response time with questions and comments. So we could be mindful of everyone's time. And I just want to say thank you to all of the artists in the room. I do not have an arts background, but it was about 15 years ago that a teaching artist came into my classroom when I was an ESL teacher in downtown Flushing. And it really changed the trajectory of my entire professional career from then on out. And still to this day, I have learned so much from all of the artists that I've worked with over that time. And I have worked now in every art form in some capacity. So while I don't have the arts background, I have been able to learn tremendous amounts from all of the artists that I've worked with. So, and I will continue to learn from all of you this evening. So thank you for that. During this time of working within the art making space, some of the things that I learned about the common characteristics between language development and art making were the things that you see on the screen right here. First is that it requires active participation. We cannot read a dictionary and think we're going to learn a language, right? It requires you to get out, go into a scenario where the language is being spoken and just kind of take that risk and jump in. The same thing is true for a ball of clay. It will not turn into a sculpture if you don't take that risk and work the clay, right? And that is true for all of the art forms. So we need to have engagement and active participation. We also understand that language making, we don't memorize things. It is part of a creative process. I think about what is relevant and what I want to say in the moment, and I develop novel ideas. You could listen your entire life and possibly never hear the same sentence repeated ever, because we don't read from a script. We actually create language as we go, just like artists are doing in their process. Language learners tend to be very observant. This is a helpful tool if you're trying to learn a new language, because you're going to take in all the clues and cues of the environment. And artists are very good at using their observation skills to put that into practice and inform what it is that they're going to create. So there was a lot of shared opportunities there for the students I was working with. And then lastly, I believe every artist is endeavoring to create something to communicate and express meaning. And that is what language does. So while we are not necessarily from the same backgrounds in terms of skill or interest area, but we are on the same journey, just using different mediums to do that. So I thank you for giving me the space to learn that. And then for this population that we're talking about specifically tonight, multilingual learners, there are, besides the fact that arts is beneficial for art's sake, we know that there are many benefits for the development of language, which is why we are able to offer this conversation this evening, because there has been a significant amount of work being done in this area over the last 5 to 10 years. So for multilingual learners particularly, the arts allow for multiple entry points. So every student has something that they're bringing to the table that is valued. They have prior knowledge that can be turned into something creative, and we can have students be more participatory than they might be, let's say, in other learning spaces. We can see that the arts are at the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy. They require higher order thinking. So there's a lot of opportunities for students to learn skills that they need in other areas of academic achievement. And the art making space creates a context for learning. So the students are engaged in something that's meaningful. It's student-based and student-focused. And because of that fact, it gives the students an immediate and authentic opportunity to really use their language in a contextualized way. And we'll talk about this in just a moment or two, but it's an opportunity to lower what we call the affective filter. And the affective filter are all the other variables that might influence language. And when students are in an art making space, it helps to reduce anxiety, helps them to focus and center on the learning process itself, and just maybe enjoy themselves a little bit while they're learning. So for those reasons and many others, it's an extremely beneficial place for multilingual learners. That being said, our goal tonight, though, is to look at really what can we do to further support and enhance that experience for the students. So while it inherently comes with many positive and beneficial attributes, there are things that we can do as we interact and create our lesson planning that will keep these learners in front of mind. So this is just a slide to help you place what you do in what is happening in the classroom. So thinking about the natural progression of learning, why we see such a beneficial experience in art in terms of art making is because it mirrors this natural learning progression with an emphasis again on the doing. So students need to become active rather than passive in order to really move from receiving information to being expressive and being able to use new language and new concepts that they are learning. So in our session tonight, we will be looking at these three key principles that will help us to find those additional supports and the additional awareness we need to support multilingual learners in this already very beneficial opportunity of art making. So we will have three segments that revolve around each of these principles. The first is going to be awareness, getting to know a little bit about the background of the learner and the background of what it looks like when you're learning language. And then segment 2 will look at strategies and supports for amplification, meaning what is it that I bring to my practice? What is it that I'm doing in the way that I am sharing information and concepts with the students that can be supported? And then the final segment is on accommodation, and that's looking at what kinds of supports can we put in to maximize participation for the students. So this is sort of the breakdown of the remainder of the session. But going back to the first example of awareness, we would like to have you participate just in a moment to kind of get into the shoes of the students, if you will. And we're going to do a short exercise in breakout rooms. And Kinsey's going to open up the rooms in just a moment. But it's simple directions. We're going to take about 3 minutes in the breakout room. So don't disappear. We're going to come right back in just a moment and share out what happened. But I just want you to think about an item of significance. It could be something that you have on you. It could be something that's in the space that you're in. It could be something that you have in a backpack or purse. It could be something that maybe has a special place in your home. So just think about an object of significance that you have, either with you, on you, in your vicinity. Just sort of connect with that object for a moment. Visualize it. Every object has a story, right? We could think about who gave us this object. When did we get this object? How long have we had this object? What is the object? Why is it significant? So in your mind, you should start to be building the story. Does everyone have an object that you can connect with? Okay, great, great. Lots of thumbs up. Wonderful. So what we're going to do is open up the rooms, and there will be 3 of you in each room, roughly 3 of you in each room. And this will take 30 seconds, but we're going to give you a full minute each. Okay, so we're going to put you in the room for 3 minutes. And there's only one rule. Okay, if you play along, there's only one rule for this activity. You're going to share the story of your object with your group mates. And the only rule is for that time, 3 minutes in the room, you cannot use any English. Okay, now, obviously, this is only Kinsey and myself. So we're not going to be the fly on the wall in every breakout room. So we're trusting you to abide by the rules of this activity just for the few minutes that we'll be there. Okay, so you're going to share your object with your group mates. You could decide who goes first and then just go around the room. Everyone shares. You could use any mode of communication except English. Okay, everyone clear? Would somebody just like to, because this is good modeling, could somebody just repeat back or paraphrase for me what it is you're going to do when you get into your breakout space?
We're going to each share our object, and without using any English, using any modality we would like.
Excellent. Thank you, Daria. Okay, so Kinsey, we're ready to go, and we'll call you back in 3 minutes. So
Yes.
welcome back, everybody. And I see so many expressions on people's faces. Most of them are joy. Unlike what the expressions were when I was giving the instructions before you went into the room, there was a little bit of a shock. There was a little bit of eyes opening, like, what is she talking about? How's that going to work? And then there were a couple of chuckles and laughs, like, can we even do something like that? But here we are. So can just 1 or 2 of you just share out, what was that like for you? Just, I know it was very quick, but a word or 2 to describe what you felt. Okay, Mary.
As an English language speaker, I was in the Zoom room with a Spanish speaking person and a Japanese speaking person. And I really could feel, I mean, I saw what it was like to not understand one word of someone else's language.
Okay. Okay. And how did that make you feel?
I was lost.
Okay. Very unsettling, right? It's unsettling. Okay. Alessandra, did you go ahead?
Yeah, I think it was interesting to notice that some of us were more fluent in other languages than others. So there was the person who was speaking very rapidly, and I realized that they had to kind of slow down and maybe do a little more pantomime. And then there was the person who was really struggling to remember all the words they needed just to get out their idea.
So thank you for that comment. And Victor said it was easy because everyone in his group shared a common language. So that's wonderful when those things happen, right? Where you can rely on another language asset that you have. If you are all in a room with different languages, well, then you have to negotiate a little bit and figure out how you do that. Now, I'm really surprised that I haven't heard a comment about how you communicated. So being that you're all artists, Johnny, can you tell me, how did you communicate in your room?
Oh, yes. And I see Aaron's commenting in the chat. We use Spanish, Aaron and me, to communicate about our objects. And I did. And it's so funny because Aaron so clearly demoed and described, and I believed right away it was a necklace. And then I don't know why I doubted myself. And then I second guessed our community, like, in our Spanish.
So so what you're saying is, besides having some Spanish being spoken, you also use gesture,
yes,
right? Because
gesture.
you're doing a lot of this. So
yes.
I'm guessing that there was physical and gesture being used as well.
Yes.
Okay, Diane.
We actually showed the objects and told stories about the objects and their meaning, and mostly we did it through pantomime. But my biggest takeaway was that one of my colleagues did this, and I just wanted so much to respond. So I think there's a two-way street here. It's not just one way.
Excellent, excellent. So, and you know, and if you kept fully to the rules of this little exercise, if somebody said something and you desperately wanted to know, you wouldn't have said, "Oh, you mean this?" or "Tell me," right? You wouldn't have used English either to get information from the person who was sharing, right? So it's like that dance and that frustration of saying, "Oh my goodness, you know, how do I get the information? Not just give it, but how do I get it from somebody? I desperately want to know what their story is." Thank you for sharing that, Lisa.
Yes, it was really interesting. I mean, the only thing I did spoken was in Spanish just to say hello. Um, but one of the three of us had their camera off the entire time and was muted the entire time. So was just watching the other two of us. So, but that I found really interesting in terms of the exercise. Like,
Okay.
I don't know who it was. So I don't know if that person was afraid to do it because it can be very uncomfortable for some people.
Okay.
And then essentially, I was the only person who shared my object, and I did it mostly through gestures and body language. And the other person just kept trying to think how can I express myself, and we
Okay.
didn't get there in the time allotted.
Okay. So so you ran out of time because there was so much thinking about how do I do this? Okay. So obviously we all understand why I've given you this as the opening exercise today, because our first segment is about awareness. And I believe that in these just few brief minutes, there has been a lot of awareness raising in this group this afternoon. And it's helpful for us to sort of feel the struggle a little bit, right? So some of you've already expressed that, the uneasiness, the not being able to make choices as fluidly as you would like, maybe having a downright fear of being participatory, and like, you're all artists, you take risks, but maybe this was too much of a risk, you're not willing to try that, right? And what I have found, I've used this exercise probably 24 times in all kinds of different groups. And there's always, more or less a similar response. But with artists, I find that usually they're like, "No problem. I have 27 different ways that I can communicate." But, we have to think about, are all of those ways equally comfortable for everybody, right? So I'm glad that you were taking the risk and trying it. So one of the things that I want us to understand from this little experience is the first, how important language is to communication. How important is the first language, or the language that you are dominant or feel comfortable in using most often? How valuable that is as a learning resource, right? And we want to emphasize that students have the ability to access the language that they are most comfortable with to be able to communicate in the moment. So that might not be English, right, for many of the students. Also, the fact that there was a tremendous risk being taken here to do this, and this was on a social topic. I just asked you to talk about an object that's meaningful to you. When we start to get into academic content, what you're doing in all of your art forms, or when the students are in other classes throughout the day, and they're asked to do the exact same thing you just did, but talk about photosynthesis in a language they don't understand. Imagine how like readily participatory you might have been if that was what I gave you as a task, right? I'll go in the rooms and all share about photosynthesis, but don't use English, right? So we have to think about that distinction between the social and the academic element. Also, there was a time limit to this. You know that there was 3 minutes of being in this maybe uncomfortable space. However, for students, this could be 7 hours a day, every single day, day in and day out, of feeling like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know how to have my voice heard. I don't know, understand anything that's going on. I'm not sure what to do. I'm sort of drowning here." So I think that, thinking about this perspective of being in this space, and how do we then put in the supports so that the students have a little bit of an edge, a little bit of an easier going time, because they are going to exceed your expectations for what you have planned for them, but they just need that little bit of awareness and sensitivity and support. And that's what we're talking about tonight. Does anybody have just one last thought or comment on this activity before we get into segment 1? Okay, great. So I will go back and share the presentation again, and we will move on to part 1. So our first principle is about awareness, which you all participated in a little bit of that just a moment ago. And this is about building background. So there are a few key concepts just to think about in terms of awareness of the learner. And we want to be mindful of their level of proficiency. So how much English do they actually have? We want to be mindful of their learning process. How do they learn best? Because that is true for all learners, right? We want to think about prior knowledge. What do they bring with them as an asset, and where might there be gaps in the prior knowledge in terms of what it is that we're trying to address or accomplish with them in any given lesson. And then also learning style. So these are the things we will talk about in this first segment. So this is by no means, I'm not going through every single aspect of this. Again, you will have this PowerPoint for you, and this is just to stop and have awareness on this point, and you will be able to look back at it when it becomes relevant for you and you need it. So just in terms of levels of proficiency, we have 4 basic levels that we identify in terms of language development, and that equates to 4 or 5 different levels that you might see if you're working in a school type setting. And we have what we call beginner, intermediate, advanced, and proficient. And these will vary by the characteristics that you would see in terms of the student's ability to communicate in a new language. We're speaking about English specifically, so I'll just use that as the language of reference for the remainder of the session. But you could see the characteristics are listed on the right-hand side. So obviously going from, understanding maybe 1 or 2 words to then moving all the way to being able to sound like completely proficient or native like in their speaking. So this is an important background factor. And if you are working in a classroom setting, if you're working in a museum, these are the types of information you can get from the classroom teachers so that you are a little bit more mindful of the audience that's ahead of you, and you could be able to put in some of the supports that will be appropriate that we will address later in the session tonight. We also want to think about the students' prior knowledge. And when we say prior knowledge, that could be cultural knowledge, that could be language knowledge, that could be previous learning experience, that could be academic level. That could also tell us about their age and developmental level, and then also their personal interests. Each student is an individual, and they have prior knowledge that will relate to things that are of personal interest to them. So just being mindful of, it's very hard. I understand if you are in a residency type program and you get to see students once a week, but knowing as much of these factors as you possibly can and having that conversation with the classroom teachers or whoever it is that is registering the students for your program will be extremely helpful in being able to appropriately support their needs and to put in the relevant supports in the instruction. And then, as I mentioned in the introduction, that opportunities in art making lower the affective filter. And these affective factors are things that we know that are like barriers that go up in the brain, and they could be lowered or they could be rose up. And depending on the environment that the students are learning in will determine what impact these factors have. So things like motivation, personality, confidence and anxiety, the attitude towards the language or the culture that they're assimilating into or learning within, all of these things will have a tremendous impact on whether the students learn the language and how quickly they will learn the language. So what we know is that in art making experiences, there is an environment that is created that will level many of these factors and make them not an impediment in terms of learning and language development. So it creates that space that the students will feel comfortable, they can feel that they are motivated, and they have a level of confidence to be able to participate and to share in the learning that is happening. So this is a tremendous benefit about art making spaces. And then we also have sociocultural factors. So these are helpful to know if we have a large demographic of one type of culture being represented in a school or the space that you're working in, because then we can really build these into practice. And it's just helpful to know, again, as much as we can in terms of the students' backgrounds, and being able to not only bring that to the lesson, but actually have the students be the ones that are sharing that. So we know that the social cultural factors influence language. Language and culture go together. So these are just some of the factors to consider. Levels of formality, who do you speak with in what sort of range, right, of formality. Eye contact, we know that is very culturally dependent. In some places, in some languages, it's not acceptable to look at someone who has a perceived higher level or status than you. Whereas in American culture, if you're not looking at somebody straight in the eye when you're talking to them, that's perceived as rude. So there are a lot of variety. There's a lot of variety in terms of how this is interpreted in a sociocultural context. In terms of communication, we have things like topic maintenance. In some languages, it is totally fine to talk about everything under the sun, and then at the end, you get to the thing that you really wanted to talk about. We tend to be not as patient in American culture. It's like, just get to the point, tell me what you want to say, right? And we expect that the main topic to be front and center of the conversation. We have aspects of turn taking that could be interpreted differently. So in some languages, it's totally fine to talk over somebody while they're talking. In American culture, that's perceived as rude. You wait your turn and you wait for the space to be able to share. So these are some things that might be misinterpreted and therefore cause confusion, misunderstandings, or even hurt feelings amongst students that come from, all the variety of backgrounds that we see represented throughout New York City. Just a couple of other things here. Proximity to speaker. If you've ever had a student that, obviously now we're in COVID, we understand about, social distancing, but prior to COVID, if you've ever had students that are like right in your face when they talk to you, that could be a cultural, cultural crossover, because in some languages you have to be like nose to nose with the person you're speaking with, because that's a sign of respect. In American culture, again, we like our space, like this is my space, this is your space, and we like that sort of clear definition. There's also a lot to consider, especially in art making, about what's considered taboo topics in different cultures. There are just certain things that are not appropriate to speak about or refer to in sort of open company or in a mixed setting when it's not, where it's outside the home. So this is important when selecting types of tasks, types of images you might explore in the classroom. Knowing the students' backgrounds will be helpful in selecting the works that you start with. Gender rules are seen differently by different cultures. The individual versus the group ethic can be different across cultures. And then just a general view on learning. We're learning in an academic setting. Not all cultures are, see that as the same way. So a lot of cultures embrace home schooling and cultural schooling and community schooling, and not necessarily going to an academic institution. And then what are the students' views of the new language and culture? So all of these have a tremendous impact on learning in general, and they are very closely tied with language use. So just being mindful of not being quick to jump to a conclusion about a student's behavior or how they respond to you in a certain way, but really knowing maybe this is a direct result of a transfer from something that is sociocultural in nature. So in this aspect of awareness, we're also going to look at a little bit about what does it mean to learn a language and what does that look like and what is the process for the students that we are talking about this evening. And I'm going to go over just 4 quick concepts with you. And again, you have this presentation to look back at. If something resonates with you, you can sort of just make a note about it and then go back to that slide and look at it in more depth. And I would be happy if you reach out to Kinsey or myself after and are interested in this topic in more depth. I'd be happy to address that with you. So the first, we touched upon a little bit in the activity that we participated in at the beginning, looking at the distinction of basic language versus academic language. So the social aspect of language is what we use every day. It's what we call survival English, the things that we would use to go about our daily life out in the community. It's the language that students are using on the playground. And even at this sort of basic level, it could take 2 to 5 years to really develop. And if you think about that, you know, we don't realize the complexity of language all the time and just what it takes to develop a language. It's a quite magnificent experience and process. So an example of that social language would be something like, how are you feeling today? Okay. On the other hand, it becomes very different in nature when we start to talk about academic language. So academic language is what we would see in a learning environment. So all of the students coming to you in your different art forms, they are encountering academic language. This is specific language that serves a specific role, and it's not necessarily the language that is being discussed around the dinner table. And because it also increases in complexity, this is something that takes 5 to 9 years to really develop. And the important thing to note about academic language is that it's not anyone's native language. So this is even a challenge for students who are native speakers of English and are going into a learning setting. Academic language has to be specifically taught. It's not something that is just picked up from the environment. And the reason to bring this up here specifically is because we have to understand that the students we are focusing on this evening, multilingual learners, are trying to do both of these processes simultaneously. So they are learning the social aspect of language, of English, and also the academic simultaneously, in addition to also learning whatever new concepts are coming up in the learning for them as well. So this is a really heavy lift in terms of the learning. And this is why it's so important to be mindful of this so that we can build in supports that will help, help alleviate some of this, the stress of this process for the students. We also have to understand that language is very complex from the standpoint of, if you say you're proficient in a language, it doesn't just mean that you can, spout out a random list of vocabulary words that you memorize. But what it means is you can have relatively complex, cohesive conversations with a number of speakers across a number of contexts. And this is what is represented by communicative competence. And when we look at what communicative competence really means, there are 4 independent competencies that make up the ability to be proficient in a language. We are very well aware and knowledgeable about the linguistic competence. That is sort of the nuts and bolts, the building blocks of language that we typically think about, like vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation. And we're aware of how that plays a significant role in being proficient in a language. However, that is only 1/4 of the story. These other 3 competencies also have a tremendous impact on the level of proficiency, and they are going to be essential for learning the language completely. So we have the sociolinguistic factors that we just talked about earlier, being formality, politeness, being able to understand cultural references, idiomatic expressions, humor. These things are very complex and highly dependent on your familiarity with the language and the culture. We also have strategic competence, which are the ways in which we make meaning, even though we might have a gap at the moment or have a misunderstanding at the moment. It's the ways that we can utilize what is available to us to overcome that gap. And we see a lot of translanguaging being used in classrooms and settings today. That would be an example of the strategic competence here. But also being able to say, excuse me, I don't understand that. Can you say that again? Can you show me in a different way? So being able to strategically get the information that you need so that you could be sure that you are understanding the conversation. And then lastly, we do not speak words in isolation, but we speak in conversation. And that is what discourse competence allows us to do. It's like the glue that holds our conversation together. So that is the ability to sort of give and get information, ask and answer questions. It's the ability to elaborate on someone else's ideas. It's the ability to agree and disagree. It's all the cohesive devices and patterns that we use to have a higher level kind of conversation. So when we have a relatively high level of competency in each one of these areas, then we can truly say or feel like we are competent and proficient in that language. And then lastly, for this awareness segment is just understanding a little bit about academic language and how this is so different from the social language that we talked about a moment ago. But there are many categories of academic language. Most of them are at a word level or at a vocabulary-based level, but there's also complexity in the grammatical and the syntactical structures at an academic language level. So these categories are just a quick reminder that when you're in your art making space, that is considered an academic area. And academic language is going to play a role in each of the learning spaces that you are in. Each art form will be specific to itself in terms of the types of vocabulary that will be addressed, that would be new and complex. And there are also opportunities for other areas of academic language, like multiple meaning words, academic language functions, which helps students talk about their thinking. And then high frequency academic words that are related to higher order thinking. And then again, these grammatically complex structures. If you're having them engage with anything that is written, that is going to be something that would be needed to take into consideration. So the examples here are from visual art, but they, from the complex content specific and the multiple meaning, but I'd be happy to discuss again other art forms if this is something that you would like additional information on down the road. So an example of a complex content specific word in a visual art setting would be a word like linear perspective. Most likely students will not encounter that word anywhere else outside of your classroom. That is not a word that they're going to be bringing home and using, with their friends and their siblings. This is a word that's going to be very specific to the type of art that you're doing that day around this topic. So that would be a brand new word. It's very specific and it's very complex. On the other hand, we could have a word like in a visual art classroom, like scale. And I'm sure you could think of several additional meanings to the word scale besides the way it might be applied in a visual art classroom, right? So Spider-Man could scale a building, there are scales on a fish, and there's a scale probably in a kitchen or a bathroom to weigh things. In addition to it talking about proportionate or relative size of two objects in it, in a visual image. So this is a very complex word in that it means slightly different depending on the context that it is in. And in the case of scale on the fish, it's completely a very different reference point. So for language learners, when they encounter a word like this, they already have a meaning for it that might be a more general application of the word. And then when they encounter it in a new space, there's a little bit of a resistance to the word in the brain because there's already a placeholder for that word. So when a new meaning comes in, it sort of, catches you off guard. You're not expecting it because you already have a meaning for that word, and it's not the meaning that's being presented in the new context. And then just finally here to note, and then I'm going to open it up for the first comment period, is these academic language functions. They're not complex words by nature, but they go along with complex thinking. So if I want students to compare, for example, two images, to dance phrases, to scenes in a movie, whatever it is that I'm working with that I have, in terms of looking at comparison, I need words like same, similar, different, alike. And those are the academic language function words that students will need to be able to effectively understand about making comparisons of these two objects, and also to be able to communicate about it. So hopefully in this segment one, I know there's a lot of information packed in here, but this is, again, here for you to look back at and to think more closely about as time goes by, as you apply it into practice. But being aware of both the students' backgrounds and also the, just the complexity and the nature of language can really help guide us in how to support the students most effectively. So I will stop the share for just a moment, and we'll open that up now for comments, questions, and connections on anything from segment one. Yeah, look at Phil look, I love the application. Thank you, Phil. The scales of the fish, right? And using multiple of the meanings in one sentence. It could get crazy, right? This language is just so complex. And the thing is, we're very good at using it. All of us are very good at using it. Sometimes we don't always have that place to reflect on it and step away and say, wow, this really is challenging for these students. And, how can I be more aware and support that? Thanks for that comment, Phil. So who has a thought, a connection, a question? Does it answer any questions for you in terms of maybe something that you've encountered already in working with multilingual learners, and you're like, oh, so that explains that. Okay, we have Matthew here. Can you explain or give an example? Okay, sure. So he's asking for the academic language function words. So there's a category. We could share these with you if this is something that you want to learn in more depth. I'm happy to pass along additional resources through Kinsey. But academic language functions are small words that convey big ideas. So for example, in the one that was on the screen, if I want to compare and contrast, that's what my mind is thinking. But I need the language to be able to support that thinking. And when I make compare or contrast statements, I will use things like, these are the same, they are different, this and that are similar, or they're alike. So those words are heavily tied to the concept of thinking about comparison. So therefore, those words are essential in being able to communicate your thinking, because not only do they, represent the concept, but they're going to help you to make that link between, the thinking and the speaking. Does that help you? Okay, thanks, Matt. Great.
One thing I'm thinking about is when I've been a teaching artist in schools and I didn't specifically ask if there were multi-language learners in the class, I sometimes didn't realize it for weeks if it was a dance class, I think because they were able to follow and learn from me and learn from their peers. And then, yeah, so I think I'm thinking about how I need to ask that question as before the residency begins always.
Yeah, and you know, it worked out relatively okay, right? But think about maybe lost opportunities that might have been better had you been able to come in with certain supports that would have alleviated maybe some of the stress on the students, right? And you have the advantage of having a more physical art form, and that is definitely advantageous, but that's not always going to be the case, right, for everyone on the call here tonight. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And I mean, that's why segment 1 is called awareness, because that's exactly what it is. It's just like, oh, let me think a little bit about who my target audience is. Who is it before me? What can I know about them so that I'm more prepared in my planning to really address their needs, you know, in a more structured or beneficial way. Right. Thank you, Daria. Does somebody else have okay, Karina. Catalina, do you have something to say? Go ahead, and then I'll read Karina's.
Hi, yes. So I had an experience teaching a workshop of filmmaking with the students who came from Puerto Rico, from Nicaragua, and it was very interesting because some of them could speak English, but most of them were more comfortable in Spanish. So I told them to communicate in the language that was more comfortable for them. And when we were making the film, we were recording the teachers spoke in English, some of them, and others in Spanish. So I would translate, and then I had subtitles for the film. But that was very interesting for me to learn how to actually work in a classroom when I have students that spoke different languages at the same time. Fortunately, it was a small classroom, but at the beginning of the course, I work on the syllabus to make it very accessible. So I knew that every material that I have to make was going to have to be bilingual. So that took twice. So instead of preparing one lesson plan, I'll have to have 2 lesson plans so I can handle the Spanish speakers, lesson plan in Spanish. And when people ask me questions in the classroom, I'll have to be speaking both languages. So it will change the amount of time we have for students, but yes. I think it's a very enriching experience.
Thank you for that. And you brought up several important points I just want to touch on, because I know that this is probably felt and echoed by most people in the room tonight. So first of all, we want to make sure that before we invest time in a strategy, we want to know that, or support a scaffold, is it going to be beneficial for the students? Now, it is so wonderful that you would want to translate all of the documents and the things that you're going to give the students into their, you know, the language they're comfortable with. However, you need to know whether that's going to be a beneficial support. Do they have literacy in that other language? Because it's one thing to use, you know, communication verbally in another language to get them to understand. But then if you try to go through Google Translate, you spend all of that time translating documents and activities and worksheets and things, and then you give it to them and they don't have literacy in the home language. It's basically, it's a nice gesture, but it's not a beneficial support. And to save yourself a lot of time, you want to know that. So if it helped out in your scenario, that would be wonderful that it did, but it's not always going to be the case. The second thing about that is that there's a misconception that in order to use a bilingual support or to use translanguaging, that we have to know the languages of the students. Not true. This is my favorite little anecdotal story from my life. I was extremely fluent in Spanish. I read Don Quixote in college in Spanish, and I had excellent literacy and language skills. And I was told that that was the thing to do if you wanted to be an ESL teacher, learn Spanish, right? So I did what I was told to do. And then I'm teaching in downtown Flushing in a school that is 95% Asian, 90% Chinese. So all the Spanish I studied did me absolutely no good in terms of really communicating with my students. And I had to get really good at translating English to English. And, a number of the things I'm discussing with you tonight come from being in those scenarios and going, oh my gosh, how do I communicate with these students? And, developing that over time. So the students are the best asset that you have in the classroom, because they're the ones that are going to translanguage. They're the ones that are going to support each other, and they will make it work. You could have 7 languages in a group and they're going to figure out, because that is what you all do. It's magic. It's like the art making space gets the students to say, I don't care what the challenge is. I'm going to figure this out because I want this to come together. I want to share this thing that I've created. I want to be part of what's going on, and they will work it out. So you need to open up the space to be welcoming for them to try out and use all the things that they already have available to them. And that is the only downside, is what Catalina said, is that this takes extra time. It doesn't take a lot of extra work necessarily. Once you have a system of how to support and how to build in the scaffolds, it gets easier and easier as you go along, because you now have sort of like a repertoire of things you do. But it does take extra time, because you have to let the students be in that moment and let them use the tools they have. And that could be, take longer than what you might have anticipated on in the lesson plan. And the segment here is going to end, and I see the comments in the chat. I just wanted to go back to Karina, because I think she asked this more than once. So in the opening activity about the object, how would you have even just given the instructions, right? So obviously I would have modeled first. Maybe I would have showed my wedding ring or some piece that, and say, and draw. I would use visuals and also scaffold it with language as well. And I would say, this is what's important to me. Can you show your, partner, or so gesturing, just all of the things that you did. I would have words charted out on the board to help support them, visuals on the board, and then also obviously the modeling. And we'll talk about those in the strategies in the second segment. Okay. Okay, Mariangela, can you, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, I mean, I wonder how effective would be to create a glossary or a vocabulary list for the lesson, like which I believe it does help discern even an English speaker and any multi-language speaker to identify the vocabulary that the takeaway, the vocabulary that is going to help them understand the lesson, and not only understanding the content, but also building vocabulary little by little.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Of those specific, especially with specific language that it's related to an art form, so that you build that little by little.
So I'm 100% on board with that. It's an absolute wonderful idea. As we go into the next segment, we're going to address something like that, but I want to just say it has to be a living glossary. It cannot be a dictionary. I see somebody on this call that could speak to this in practice, and maybe she'll give a touch on that later on. But it has to be that they've built it from experience. It's not you giving them words, them writing these words down, and you think that they've learned it. It's they have embodied it. If you're in dance class and now they've embodied it, you give a label to it and say, that was this, that was that. Now put it in the glossary. If you're a visual artist, it's that they've worked it out already with their hands. They've done it. And now you say, okay, what you just did is this. Now let's put it in the glossary. And then having additional support in that glossary, whether it be a translation, if that helps, whether it be an example of it, whether it be a visual to help support that. So when they look back to these words that they've created, there's a real contextualized meaning to it. So absolutely, really important. Okay, that I want to hear from all of you, and I just want to be mindful of time too. But Diana, real quick, go ahead. Diane,
Okay,
sorry.
just building on what Mariangela said, we teach these technical terms to English language speakers as well. And what we do often in dance is we have a word wall. And when we do the thing, we put it up on the word wall. I love Velcro, so we can take it out. And so,
Excellent.
yeah.
Yeah, and just having it even on a card that's kinesthetic. So now when they're using it or interacting, that word is there for them. It's tangible, and they could move it to the different scenarios where they're going to use it. Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone who shared in that segment. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry, I will go back and look at the chat also if I missed anybody. So in terms of looking at the language, we want to make sure that we're aware of how language is functioning in the art making space, and think about what language will be purposeful, intentional, and explicit. So this little acronym PI is a good reminder of thinking about what is the language that will help my students be successful in understanding what I'm teaching today, and also be able to utilize it effectively when it comes to talking about this topic. And PI stands for purposeful, intentional, explicit. So purposeful is picking out the language that's going to be the most relevant. If you're working with students at the entering, emerging, which are at the beginning level of proficiency, they may not have very many words in English at all, right? You're building sort of from the ground up at that point. But so all the words that you are saying are brand new. But what you have to do is pick a starting point. What are going to be those most relevant words? A handful, 3, 4, maybe 5 at most, okay, that you want to really address specifically in the new lesson. Intentional means that it's not just a word they're going to hear you say, but it actually has application. They're going to be using it, engaging with it, applying it. Otherwise, they have not learned it. If they haven't taken ownership of the word and have actually applied it, they did not learn it. And then explicit. This is our part here. What is it that we're doing to make it visible to the students, that they can embody it in some way? Maybe it's on a word wall or in a glossary, and that they're exposed to it in all 4 modalities. They're hearing it, they're seeing it, they can possibly be able to read it and to write it, okay? So PI could be a helpful acronym. So language can, this is the number one question I get asked all of the time. Is there a list of, like, you know, where I can go and to sort of look at like what language is going on in a particular case? And the answer is no, because of what I had said in the introduction, that language is novel and unique. We create it based on the experience that we are in. So there's not like a list that you could say, okay, here's all the language you need in an a visual art classroom. Here's all the language you'll use in a music classroom. But there are some commonalities across art forms that are sort of big ticket items here in terms of language. We're always using the demonstrative pronouns, this and that. This movement shows, this picture shows, that color represents. So this and that have a lot of usage in a art making space. All of your specific terminology, music vocabulary, visual art vocabulary, dance vocabulary, all of those will play a role as well, obviously. We do a lot of giving and getting feedback. Students can look at other students' creations and give feedback to one another. So that's going to be something that will be, you know, needed to be supported. Giving opinions, agreeing and disagreeing, use of modals, should, would, could. So if you're in the revision process of, you know, revising a dance, revising a collage, whatever it is that, you know, you're moving towards, revising scene work, using should, would, and could comes up often. Developing questions, descriptive language, all of the art forms are big with the use of adjectives and describing the different sensory aspects of what you do. Thinking also all of the art forms elicit emotion. So emotion words And then we tend to talk a lot about the in the present progressive tense, which is the ing, you know, walking, jumping, drawing, painting, singing. And so that is, you know, a new formulation of a verb tense. So these are just some ways that language might be specifically addressed within your practice. So in the second segment, we're going to look at amplification. So this is the next two, while the first principle was about awareness and thinking about the process, the next two segments are about the actual supports. So this is sort of where the rubber meets the road here, and thinking about how do we appropriately support. And with amplification, the goal here is how do we get maximum comprehension for our students? What is it that we do that we can add to practice to increase that? And the goal here is always going to be to amplify, not simplify. So we don't want to think about what we're teaching and think about how to scale it down, because we might have students who are at an entering or emerging level of English, but rather thinking about adding some of the supports we're going to talk about in this segment and amplifying the language environment that we are teaching in. So we're going to look at these four specifically, and then there will be a list of all different options that you can go back to and make choices about. So these are just, you know, if you wanted a snapshot of what are some of the ways that you can support students' comprehension, these are a number of very, very effective ways. And what I love about these supports is that they're not mutually exclusive. They are going to be able to be used in conjunction with one another for increased comprehension. So I know that as you look at this list, you have probably incorporated many of these into practice. So modeling, all artists are great at giving a demonstration and showing students first before asking them to do that. So that is your version of modeling. We just talked about the value of using the student's home language, whether it be by you or by the students, totally fine. It's clear how visuals are necessary. We also can think about repetition and paraphrasing, like when I was going to send you out into the breakout rooms, I said, can somebody please say back what is the task that's before you? And that's a wonderful tool for students to practice the language, but it also helps because sometimes just hearing it in another voice will, make it clearer for you in some way. So getting students to paraphrase is a wonderful tool. And we'll talk about some of these in a little bit more detail in just a moment, but I'm sure you could see many of these that you have employed. Is there one on here that is not familiar? This is, I'll break the protocol just so that we can address it right here. Is there one of these strategies that is completely, you've never heard of, that I can just address in the moment? Okay, Diane?
Pre-teach vocabulary?
Okay, so pre-teach vocabulary means that before the students would be expected to engage with those words, that you have sort of explicitly, right, put it out on a chart, or did what you said, put it on a word wall. So yeah, you intuitively knew it because you're doing it. So you just didn't know the label for it. That's totally fine. So again, this is a quick snapshot of just some ways that we can build in supports relatively easily. These don't take a lot of additional time to add in, and they just make practice better in general. While what we're talking about tonight is specifically geared towards multilingual learners, these are beneficial strategies for all students.
Jen, there's a few questions in the chat.
I did not see that. It didn't come up on my screen. Thank you. Okay, so what does music mean in this context? So being able to bring in another art form, for example. So if you're a visual artist, music can enhance the visual art. Obviously, music is necessary in dance, but thinking about other ways to combine art forms so that there's another kinesthetic element or a musical element or a visual element, okay? Yeah, songs, absolutely. And level text. So if the students are reading it, if you're reading about, you know, the background of a composer in a music classroom, if you're reading about a particular artist, maybe having the text at more than one readability level, so or in different languages, so that students would be able to maybe access the written material in a different fashion. So that's what level text was. It might not be very relevant in your context, but if you are giving them something to read, it's helpful to think about, is it at their reading ability level, or can I just have the same, you know, information presented in two different readability levels? So in order to apply these supports appropriately and effectively, we want to be thinking about where do we use them and how do we use them. And this is thinking, you know, in terms of bridging the gaps. I may want my students to be able to say, you know, why did the artist make this artistic choice to use so much red in the painting? What was the artist communicating by making that choice? And that's a very high level, very sophisticated conversation. Okay. But that doesn't mean because we have students that are various levels of language proficiency that we shouldn't try to attempt it. And it doesn't mean that we could just drop that question out there and just hope that some students will be able to answer it. We really need to build in the scaffolds that are going to help the students to get from where they are in their understanding, which might be all the way back here at, you know, what is your favorite color? But we want to move them in the trajectory of being able to have this conversation about why the artist used, you know, red as the primary color in this painting. So we would build up and scaffold through questioning and making the language visible for the students to be able to move that conversation along. So having the students just name, if your emphasis on this discussion has to do with color, so the names of the colors would be essential, right? So just quickly jotting that down before this conversation begins could be helpful. It gives a visual reminder of the color words. Then of the list that you just generated, you can ask them, so which of these is your favorite color, right? So just by going back a few steps in the conversation to build the students up, scaffold that so you can take them along in the direction you want to go is extremely helpful. And this gives you opportunities throughout to continue to scaffold their understanding of the concept and also the development of language. So the next question might be something like, you know, what are some things that could be this color? And having them make connections or references to things that they recall that would be the color that is in it, you know, that they just referenced as their favorite. Now we start to segue this conversation into, well, how does that color make you feel? And now we're building up emotion words, talking about emotion. Then we could get into looking at the image and saying, okay, well, you know, looking at this image, how do you feel? And how does this color play a role in that? So it's bringing the conversation along. And yes, this does take a little bit more time, but it really helps to shore up and give a solid foundation to the conversation, which is going to build the students' confidence to be able to come in and be participatory and to share what they are thinking. So when we employ these strategies that we just saw on the page before, the scaffolds for comprehension, it's going to be filling in these gaps so that the students can make that bridge between where they currently are in terms of their understanding and language use to where you want them to go. Yes, absolutely. Victor commented about the colors and culture. Absolutely. And that's a wonderful conversation to be had, because now, you know, you can ask the students to elaborate a bit on that, right? Why does it make you feel that? What is the, you know, the connection or the reference point? That is a wonderful way to build in the students' prior knowledge. So the next this was listed on that large chart with all of the scaffolds, but I wanted to take a moment to really emphasize this because this one touches on a number of areas in terms of support, and it's really essential. And this is this idea of contextualization. We want to avoid ever teaching or referencing anything in isolation, but rather consider how do we frame what it is that we want students to understand and learn, specifically when it comes to new language. So contextualization could be done a number of ways. We talked about this at the beginning of the segment already, activity before content, getting right away an experience. And that's what you did when we went into the breakout rooms. You had that experience first, and then now you can build everything else that comes in the conversation tonight around the fact that you had that experience. So as quickly as possible, giving students something tangible as the anchor for the learning, and then the language and the new information is going to connect to that in a meaningful way. Even if you are not in visual art, images are very powerful. You can use an image in a dance classroom. You could use an image in a music classroom, and it will speak 1,000 words, right? That's what images do. So it's a great starting point to build up whatever concept it is that you're going to teach. You would find an appropriate image that is going to relate and give students an opportunity to build up a conversation or have a discussion, which is the next contextualization. And then thinking about them making connections right away when you're going to introduce a new idea, a new concept, a new vocabulary word, getting the students to think about how can this relate to what they already know or what they're learning maybe in a different context, or what they have as a cultural reference point, and being able to create, again, that frame around the new information. And then lastly, this cannot be overemphasized. Considering always, and as artists, you are very aware of this, and you do this so well, considering a multimodality approach, thinking about how many ways can we get the same information to the students using different modalities. And this is an amazing diagram that comes from learning research, but it basically says that when you use only one modality or one specific modality, this is what you can expect in terms of understanding and retention. So when you just talk and talk, you're just speaking to the students with no other support, there is a retention of 5% of what's being said. If there is a reading, or you put the words on the board and you're asking them to read as you go along and teach the new word, now that goes up to 10%. If there's an audio visual component, right, that like a PowerPoint, like some type of a visual tool, it goes up to 20. And these increase in terms of their the benefit that they provide when you combine modalities. So the more that I put together, the higher the retention rate. But you could see, as we said at the beginning of the session too, is that we don't see maximum learning until we cross that threshold from passive to participatory. It's when the learning goes into the hands of the students where we see the maximum learning taking place. 50% in a discussion group, 75% when they're actually practicing by doing it. And if in order to teach somebody else, you have to have a 90% retention rate. And this is what's important about this diagram, is that this is when learning is happening in the same language that is familiar or common to the students. We're talking about multilingual learners tonight. So let's just be conservative and cut these into half, right? So when you're in a circumstance where this is going on in a language that's not familiar to you and you're only lecturing, that's 2.5%. It's like almost, why did you go through the motions of doing the lesson? The students only took away 2.5% of what was said. So for multilingual learners in particular, we have to get to this participatory type of teaching as quickly as possible so that the students will really be able to understand and retain what is being said. So that is the end of segment 2. So Catalina, you already have your hand up. So if we can comment, question, or anything about amplify, not simplify. Catalina, go ahead.
Yeah, I love this multimodality presentation. I think it's really important. And just entangled with that topic, I think it's really important to consider that someone who comes from a different background and speaks another language, as it happened to me when I came to the United States, it will be more motivated to learn when there is some familiarity with what's being taught in their own way. So it could be a song, or it could be a day when you have something said in their own language, or there is something, a poster in the classroom that reflects other culture, celebrates them. I think, unfortunately, a lot of places are not informed about those practices, and you as a foreigner come into a classroom that is totally not informed about your culture. So I try to practice the opposite with my students, so they feel more engaged with what's possible in the classroom. That's why sometimes I have things in Spanish and things in English, but I just wanted to bring that up because in the past, when I did everything in English, I lost a lot of people. That, of course, depends on the level of how fluent they are, and all that is very important. But I think just to have the sensibility for somebody else's language is really important. It's crucial in develop this connection with the students, so they feel they've been taken care of, and where they come from, it also means something. And it's not just like, okay, now everybody, we're here in the United States, so we all have to learn English. And it's a bit forced sometimes, especially if you're a child and you don't understand that you have to, you're supposed to be speaking English and you can't. Then I have students that won't say anything for 2-3 weeks, and that's not going to work too. So I just think like it's important to have that in mind.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. So the multimodality, not only is it the modality, but then in what language or culture is that represented? And that goes back to the slide prior about the contextualization. So using those connections between the other language and the other cultures is going to create the context that's necessary for them to make the jump or the bridge into English. Absolutely. Does somebody have another connection or comment or a question?
Hi.
Hi, Reina, go ahead.
I have a question. I teach in a music class once a week at an elementary school, and it's bilingual in nature, and so they're young kids. The age range is like 6 to 10, 6 to 9, whatever, 5 to, I don't know, yeah, 6 to 10, I think. Anyway, and so we're actively teaching in both languages, in English and Spanish. And I think something that I'm thinking about as I'm learning from you is like how to bring the students into more communication with each other. Like what's worked the best right now, we're like writing a song, and you know, we're writing verses in Spanish with the kids who speak Spanish, and then the kids who speak English are writing their verses in English, and we're singing the choruses in both languages together. But I guess I'm interested in like, how can I?
Okay, so you're actually, yeah, absolutely. And you're actually ready for the next segment, which is the accommodation part. And that is the participatory. So I think there's going to be a lot of answers to that in this final segment, because this was about what do we do to support our instruction so that we can sort of maximize the students' understanding. And what your question is more related to is how do we get them to participate more? And that is the next segment on accommodation. So can I defer that to the next segment and see if you get some answers there? And then if not, you could ask it, we can address it after.
Totally, thank you so much.
Okay, great. Any other thoughts, connections, comments? Daria's made a comment about a lot of these are best practices in early childhood. Yes, and you know why? It's because we understand. It's like we forget when we're working with young children. We understand they're young children, And it's like, okay, and they learn a certain way. And we're very good at matching how we teach in, typically in early childhood. But then we sort of forget that, learners are still learners, and they need to have things presented in certain ways, and they need to feel motivated, and they need to be engaged, and things need to make sense, and things need to be purposeful. We kind of forget that as we move into upper grades, and it's like, they're still people. They're still learners. Why do we think that, the learning has to change? That's just not the case. And that's why I love working with artists, because you all get this. You all get it, because you're used to approaching, learning and teaching and all of these experiences is such a different way. And that different is what is missing from the majority of classrooms. And it's just so great that you are able to go into these spaces and influence a teacher like me, right? It's because I'm here because an artist came in my room and it was showing me their practice, and I'm like, that's good, and I need more of that. So we both learned from each other, and it was a give and a get, and it was one of the greatest professional experiences in my life to work with that artist. It was a dance artist. Yeah, universal design. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're going to go into our final segment, and then we'll open it up for as much time as we have for any other questions and comments. So the last segment is on accommodation. So now, what do we do to help support or scaffold students' production, of language, their participation in our learning segment? So we're going to look at 4 different aspects here as well. We'll start with a general overview again of some different supports, and then we'll go into a little bit more depth on a few of them. So just like we looked at the strategic supports for building comprehension, we could do the same in terms of turning it over to the students. How do we maximize the participation in the classroom? How do we get the students to all feel comfortable to share? How do we make sure that there is space for all the voices to be heard? When we use some of the supports that you see projected on the screen here, this is sort of like that the diving board. This is the place that they are able to say, okay, now that I have that support, I'm willing to jump into this conversation. I'm willing to take the risk and be part of the discussion that's going on. So many of you, again, would be familiar with these sentence starters, prompts, sentence frames. Again, allowing students to respond in their home language, even if you need to have another student to translate or to share out what they've said, or even if you can't, at least the student had the space to have their voice part of the conversation. And whether you understood it or the rest of the class did or not, might not be the most important thing, but the student said what was on their mind, and they were able to do it in a language that was comfortable. Sometimes we might need to put students together in partnerships and have language buddies where, they're accountable to each other. Maybe they're supporting each other with the same home language, or maybe they're not. But sometimes, you just need a little hand holding or a little bit of support to feel confident to do something. So rather than everything being assigned individually, they could do it in partnerships or as buddies. Collaborative tasks. Just by the fact of setting up something to be collaborative versus individual is making that space for the language to happen in an authentic and meaningful way. It's now they have to plan together. Now they have to use what you've taught them to build something wonderful with their group. And there's going to be a lot of authentic learning and a lot of meaningful language use in those cases. Being able to use different types of questions, we'll talk about that in a moment. Does anybody know what the anticipated wait time is in the classroom? When you ask a student a question, what is the typical wait time for us as teachers? Does anybody know? Bree is saying 15 seconds. You are so generous and so patient. Matthew, even 10 seconds. Okay, Daria, 3 seconds. It is 3 seconds. We tend to wait 3 seconds before we volley the question to the next person. So I don't know what that says about us. We are maybe impatient people. I'm not really sure. We have a lot on our plate in each lesson. I get it, but we wait about 3 seconds. It is recommended that for multilingual learners, we wait 8 seconds. It's 5 extra seconds for them to be able to think and to process and to be able to go back and forth in between the two languages. How many times might we have had a student that would have shared something, but they just were a couple of seconds too short in being able to say it before the person, with more proficiency raised their hand and shared instead? So being just mindful of little things like that, 5 seconds is not a lot in terms of classroom, but it could mean a lot in terms of the participation by the student. Using tools like graphic organizers, you could use this in dance rooms, music rooms, having students to see sort of visually, it's like a visual note taking where they can use different images and graphics to help report out what they're thinking or what they're about to do. So graphic organizers could be really helpful. Providing a word bank so students have a reference point of the relevant words for just now in this exercise, and they could use that to help them. Allowing not just verbal, but physical responses as well. Getting the students to, again, also in a multimodality approach to share out. And then developing protocols. Protocols will develop a routine so students know what to expect and know how to engage in a discussion in your classroom. So that could be a certain type of question, a certain type of process in which you respond to questions in the classroom. Just that sort of predictability of how this conversation is going to go can be a tremendous support for the students. Now, the key here to implementing any of these supports, effectively, is to be aware of having realistic expectations. So going back to our segment 1 about awareness, I gave you information about the different proficiency levels. And this is sort of the next part of that chart. Depending on the student's level of proficiency, and that's why it's so important to get this information of their background, if you can, depending on their level of proficiency, it's going to tell you realistically, what are they able to do in English? These expectations for production are not about cognitive ability. Okay, I'm going to say that again. This is not about cognitive ability, what they understand, what their level of learning is. This is about what is realistic in terms of that level of proficiency that they will be able to do in English. So you could see a student at an entering or the most basic level of proficiency, they will be able to do things that require a lot of nonverbal response, like repeating just right what you said, circling, pointing, matching, drawing, acting out, making choices, right? Like choosing between one thing or the other. And you could see that the expectations increase as the level of proficiency increases, because we could ask them to have more of a demand on the language use in English because they are increasing in their proficiency level. So this chart right here is extremely helpful if you are in a setting where you have a lot of different levels of proficiency, because this will determine how you can differentiate a little bit so that you can make sure that there is something for each student that they are able to share out and show you what they know and participate in a way that is appropriate for their language. So this will be a real helpful chart for you to go back to, as you think about planning for your group of students. Now, one of the examples that were on, the larger slide of all the different supports was about varied questions. I could do an entire 3-hour presentation just on this. So I'm going to do the best I can to give you this in about 2 minutes. But the way we ask questions has a significant impact on how students are going to respond. And without thinking about this, we tend to just have 2 or 3 types of questions in our pocket, and we just recycle them over and over again, and we just change out what the question is in reference to. And that is not really productive in terms of generating really good and engaging and appropriate conversations in the classroom. But just by thinking about how we ask questions, it could really change the participation landscape in the classroom. So these are just some ways to think about it. First is the structure. What is the question actually asking the students? Because we might think that it's, eliciting one type of information, and the students are hearing it completely different. So for example, if I said, I know that this is not true, this is just an example. Why is visual art better than dance? Right? Why is that a bad question? Because I've already asserted an assumption and I've put my opinion in it, possibly, right? That visual art is better than dance. So now the students have to think about not what they think, but about supporting what I have imposed in the question. So this is a bad question. I might restructure it and say, which do you think is more beneficial, visual art or dance? Right now, it opens up the conversation for students to have their own opinion. We have to be careful about embedded types of questions. So if we are in the classroom and I'm trying to get the students to bring me the materials, right, that we need to get started, a question might be, who knows where the paintbrushes are? So when students are learning language, they look for patterns, and they know that these WH words that create sentences, to create questions, are important for identifying what I'm supposed to answer. And what is the first WH word that the student hears is who. And you're not looking for a who, you're looking for a where, right? So this is an embedded question. It's going to be extremely complex for students at an entering or emerging level. So thinking about how we actually structure the question, very important. Then we have to think about delivery. If you ask a student a yes or no question, don't expect an elaborate response when the question you've asked only requires a yes or no. If you wanted a more elaborate response, then you should have asked the question in a different way, right? So thinking about that. This is something we practice often that in the programs that I work in, but rather than saying, who has any questions, say, I'm ready for questions now, or I'm taking questions now. Just by changing the way you deliver that gives it an entirely different feel. So when I say who has questions now, most students don't want to be put in the spotlight. They don't want to be the one that has the question. But if you say, I'm ready for questions now, it's assuming there should be questions, and it's opening up the space now for a discussion to happen. Then we could also be mindful of the method. So thinking about the wait time, right? Rather than just rapid fire questions, being able to be mindful and think about one question, give wait time to respond. Give a follow-up question that is linking to the previous question, right? Being able to be mindful of the distribution of response. Don't just call on the student with the hands up. Say, no, we're going to wait until everyone's thought about it. And being comfortable in the silence and waiting and giving that increased time. And then applying a number of the other supports that we just talked about, going from an easier question to a more complex question, or being able to give additional context about the question so that they're able to answer it. Or even, this is very, very helpful and very, very insightful, is asking the students to generate the questions. Not every question has to come from us. And they often ask more intriguing questions, more complex questions, more interesting, more engaging questions than we ever would. So giving the space for them to do that. I'm going to, just for the purpose of time, not go over this one, but the slide is just additional things to think about. If this is an avenue you want to pursue in terms of questioning, you could read this slide. And then this is sort of it, looking at it from a differentiation standpoint. And again, I will give Kinsey, if we need to, additional materials that support some of these concepts of tonight, if anybody's interested in going into more detail. But we could ask different questions for different purposes. And this is a neat chart to go back to and to think about. When you ask questions, they're going to elicit a specific kind of information. And are they getting at the things that we want students to know? So we could differentiate our question by the purpose of the information the students will respond with. We could differentiate the question by the complexity that's required in the response in terms of how much language. So a pointing and prompting question like, show me a straight line, or a demonstration question like, show me a straight line with your arm. These are not require any verbal response, all the way up to an open-ended question where they need a lot of language to respond to that. We could also change our questions based on cognitive complexity, like, is it a recall question or is it a higher level question, right? So you could look at the examples in this category here. And this is from a Project Zero from Harvard that I absolutely love. They were built in the visual arts, but it could be used in any of the art forms, but actually breaking questions down even by learning style. So thinking about how do students interpret the information at a more personal level to make a connection to the question and be able to respond. So we could have questions that are differentiated by these different learning styles. So if this is something that you feel could really inform your practice, I encourage you to go back to these slides and look at them in more depth in terms of creating questions that will, raise the level of conversation in your classes. And then finally, last piece on the segment, just like we talked about the multimodality input, we can also allow for multimodality output, and getting the students to show us what they know, what they're excited about, what they've created, what they love, all using different mediums and modes to do it. Not everything has to be a verbal English response. They could, show us something in written form, physical form, visual, symbolic, in another language, just like you did in the breakout rooms at the start of today. So I will break there at the close of that before we do the entire closeout for the session. Thoughts, comments, questions, connections about input or output.
That was the big light bulb moment for me, was like making sure that the question word you're using is appropriate. Like, who knows where the paintbrushes are? I'll definitely have to think about that.
Yeah, all of these things are, again, just to like kind of spur something in our brain to say, okay, let me step back and think about that. Like, what does that really look like when I'm in the classroom? Because we don't always stop and think about these things. So that is what tonight was about. It's like exactly what you said, just building that awareness of saying, okay, am I a little bit more, can I be more mindful of that? What am I actually doing? Do I, think about these questions ahead of time? Do I plan for them? And what happens is we get so bogged down in the moment because we have 30 students in front of us. We might have had a bad day ourselves. There's something else going on down the hallway. We're not in our typical environment, whatever it is. We're not often going to be generating like really good questions in the moment. So we have to step back and think about it a little bit ahead of time so that we have the best possible outcome when we're actually in front of the students. Thank you for that, Daria. I know, Diane, this is like so much. But this is my 25th year as an educator, and I've been through professional development all of those 25 years. And my feeling was always, if I could take one or two new ideas away from each workshop I go to, I'm golden, right? And it's like, I always think that I might not have found a space for everything, but I always end up going back and saying, oh, you know what? Now I need that. Let me go find it. So I would rather have left you with more than less, because there are 40 something participants here, and every one of you are in a different art form, in a different space that you're teaching in, and it would be impossible for me to know how to narrow that down to have something that is going to make everyone happy. And I wanted to make everybody happy and be able to connect in some way. So I appreciate that. Anybody have a comment or thought about the participation? Raina, did that sort of help you a little bit, that third segment?
Yeah, it definitely did. And I think I'm just having this idea about breaking, like, yeah, putting kids in smaller groups, and it's definitely getting my gears turning about creative solutions. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, great. So so it sounds like to me that just rethinking about the distribution of who works together, right? It doesn't just have to be an individual student, but maybe sometimes partnerships, sometimes small groups. That could be really, really helpful. I see some positive comments. Thank you. Thank you. I'm just so delighted to be here with all of you. So in closing, and I'll just leave it open then after, until the time runs out. But this is what I've taken from all of you over the last 15 years of working with so many different artists. But art making creates authentic and immediate experiences where the learners can practice language in a meaningful way. This is such a wonderful space for this group of learners, for multilingual learners. And just by us being a little bit mindful, being here today, building our awareness about the learner, the learning process, and what are some possibilities for supports and scaffolds can really enhance this experience tremendously for them. It's already a great place, but there are so many ways we could even connect and tap into its true potential for multilingual learners. So I really thank you for being here tonight. I thank you for going at the pace that I have gone so that we can kind of accomplish all of this. And I am available through Kinsey to address any of these, if you need to troubleshoot down the road and want additional resources, supports of any kind. I am so happy to help you do that. And are there any comments, questions, thoughts before I turn it back to Kinsey and she closes us out? I appreciate all of the comments in the chat. Thank you. Thoughts or comments? Okay, Diane.
I'm going to visit a mentee at an international school tomorrow, and I'm wondering if they are in communication with you. And
okay,
yeah, that's
a great question. So let me just, if I could do a little plug for that just for a moment. So the international network of schools are a little bit separate from the other schools in the DOE in that they do have their specific set of curriculum and the ways that they function. And they are schools that take in only multilingual learners. And they are one of the highest functioning schools in the entire Department of Education. And it's because they are doing what we are doing here. They are aware of who their audience is. They are able to make good strategic choices. And they are really connecting and making the learning real for the students. So they are doing great work. I am not, I have been in the past, through my the hat that I wear as a professor, I have been in those schools with my student teachers and so on and so forth, but they do marvelous work and they are very up to speed on this because this is their population. That is who they service and they're doing a wonderful job at it. So yes, you will have a common language now. When you start throwing these terms out at them, they're going to be like, whoa, Diane, I didn't know you're so well versed in multilingual learners, right? So I think you're going to have a great experience with that. Alexa has a wonderful comment about the arts working with multilingual learners. And there are a lot of initiatives like this going on throughout the city in all art forms. And so there's lots of ways to tap into this work. So thank you all again, and I'll turn it back to Kinsey as she closes us out for tonight.
Thank you so much, Jen. And I know I'm just going to echo some of the comments that are coming through that are just so, so appreciative of you offering so much insight and like this very dense material in these very packed 2 hours. We're so, so grateful to have you here and sharing your expertise with us all. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for being here. Jen, again, thank
No,
you.
Thank
so
you. It was a
much.
pleasure. Hope to see you all down the road somewhere again. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
All righty. Have a lovely evening all. Thank you.